The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It tore across the Arizona desert, a furious living thing that stripped the last dry leaves from the mesquite trees and whipped sand into a blinding fury. Ethan Cole Colton, a man who had sought isolation with a fierce, almost religious conviction, was inside his small log cabin, trying to ignore the world outside. The year was 1880, but for Cole, time had blurred into a monotonous, unforgiving expanse. He was a ghost in the desert, a relic of a war he could no longer justify, trying to bury the ghosts of men he'd killed. His cabin was a testament to his solitude, a single room, sparsely furnished with a cot, a rough-hewn table, and a cast-iron stove that rattled with every gust of wind. The air inside was thick with the scent of pine and stale coffee. He sat at the table, a chipped enamel mug in his hands, staring into the flickering flame of a tallow candle. The light danced on the worn lines of his face, accentuating the deep-set eyes that had seen too much. His hands, though calloused from splitting wood and mending fences, still remembered the weight of a rifle. He was a man built for war, now at odds with his own nature, trying to find a peace that felt forever out of reach. A sudden violent gust hit the cabin, shaking it to its foundations. A low groan of protest from the timbers was followed by a sharp, cracking sound. Cole rose, his body moving with an economy of motion honed by years of military life. He grabbed his worn canvas coat, tied a bandana over his mouth and nose, and stepped outside. The world was a swirling chaos of dust and grit. The cracking sound had been the trunk of an ancient juniper tree, now split in two and leaning precariously towards his cabin. He knew he had to act fast, or risk the whole structure being crushed. He worked with a grim determination, the sand and wind an invisible enemy trying to blind and choke him. He had just managed to secure a rope to the fallen half of the trunk, intending to pull it away, when he saw it. A shape, half buried in a tumbleweed-choked gully, barely visible through the swirling dust. It wasn't an animal. The angle of the head, the shape of the body. It was a person. Cole's first instinct was to turn away. He'd come to this desolate place to escape humanity, to escape the consequences of its violence. His past was a tapestry of bloodshed and grief, and he had no desire to weave more threads into it. But the wind howled a different tune, a sound that carried a faint, almost imperceptible groan. It was the sound of suffering. He couldn't ignore it. It was the same sound that had haunted his dreams for years. He stumbled down the gully, the ground slick with loose stones and sand. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a young woman. Her clothes were a tattered mix of homespun and buckskin, her long, dark hair matted with blood and dirt. She lay twisted at an unnatural angle, a crimson stain spreading across the sand beneath her. Her face, what he could see of it, was a mask of bruises and cuts. He saw the marks of a struggle, the deliberate cruelty of a beating. He saw the cold brutality of men who viewed a human life as nothing more than a resource to be exploited and discarded. His stomach twisted with a familiar, bile-filled anger, the same rage he had felt when he saw the aftermath of a raid on a peaceful Apache settlement years ago, an image that had driven him from the army and into this self-imposed exile. He knelt beside her, his movements cautious. She was alive. He could see the shallow, ragged breaths she took. Her eyes, half closed, were a dark, unreadable brown. They held no fear, only a profound, exhausted pain. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on something far away. He noticed the ornate beadwork on her moccasins and the remnants of a beautiful fringed tunic. She was Apache. The realization was a sharp pang in his gut. The same people he had been sent to fight, to civilize, to push onto reservations. Now one of them was in his hands, at his mercy. He worked quickly, his military training taking over. He assessed the damage, a broken arm, a deep gash on her forehead, and what looked like internal injuries from the way she was clutching her abdomen. He knew he couldn't leave her. The storm would finish what those men started, but taking her to his cabin, to his sanctuary, was a violation of his own code of isolation. It was a step back into a world he had sworn to leave behind. He looked at her again, at the brutalized face, the fragile body. He expected to see only scars. He expected to see a broken shell, a victim. But there, in her eyes, in the fierce, unyielding pride that somehow survived the beating, he saw something else. A flicker of life, a defiant spark that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't a spark of a flame, but a small ember, glowing with a quiet resilience. It wasn't beauty in the conventional sense, not what a man expected to find in a woman's face, but a true beauty of the human spirit. He lifted her, her body light and limp in his arms. The wind screamed louder, as if in protest, but he ignored it. He carried her back to the cabin, the heavy weight of the past settling on his shoulders with every step. He was no longer a ghost in the desert. He was a man with a burden, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, and a life that was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The storm outside raged, but the real tempest was just beginning, inside the four walls of his cabin. The storm raged for another 2 days, trapping them inside the cabin. Naheli, the Apache woman, lay on Cole's cot, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket. Cole, a man of action, was now a man of stillness, his every movement a careful, deliberate act of care. He had no medical training, only the rough-and-tumble knowledge of a soldier patching up his comrades. He cleaned her wounds with water he boiled on the stove and tore strips from an old shirt to fashion crude bandages. The gash on her forehead, a jagged, ugly wound, was the worst. He packed it with a poultice of herbs he'd learned to identify from a trapper long ago. He reset her broken arm as best he could, the low guttural cry she'd made at the moment of pain, a sound that had torn at something deep inside him. She remained mostly unconscious, her fever a constant, worrying presence. Her skin was hot and clammy, her breathing shallow and ragged. In the quiet moments when the wind was just a whisper against the walls, Cole would sit beside the cot, watching her. He had seen countless bodies, living and dead, in his time. But this was different. This wasn't a body on a battlefield. This was a person, a life hanging by a thread, and for the first time in a long time, Cole felt the sharp, uncomfortable burden of responsibility. He wasn't just a soldier following orders. He was a man making a choice. He found himself talking to her, a low, steady murmur in the silence. He told her about his life, the things he had seen, the things he regretted. He spoke of the vast open sky, the way the stars looked like a spilled handful of salt at night, the way the saguaros stood like silent sentinels on the horizon. It was a strange, one-sided confession, a way to purge the poison from his soul. He didn't know why he was sharing these things with a woman who couldn't hear him. Maybe it was for his own sake. Maybe it was an offering, a small, fragile bridge built between two worlds that were meant to be enemies. On the third day, the fever broke. Naheli's breathing became more even, her skin cooler to the touch. When she finally opened her eyes, they were clear and alert, though still filled with a profound weariness. They met Cole's gaze without fear, without surprise. She saw him not as a monster, not as a savior, but simply as a man. She tried to speak, but only a dry whisper escaped her lips. Cole immediately poured some water into a tin cup and held it to her mouth. She drank greedily, her eyes never leaving his. He saw a glimmer of gratitude, but it was quickly masked by a fierce private pride. She was a survivor, not a victim. He understood that. He had been a survivor for a long time too. For the next week, their communication was almost entirely non-verbal. Cole would bring her food, a simple stew of salted deer meat and wild roots he'd preserved, and she would eat, slowly, deliberately. She would point to the fire, and he would stoke it. She would point to the bandages on her arm, and he would change them. There was a quiet understanding between them, a language of actions that transcended the chasm of their different worlds. Cole learned to read her subtle cues, the slight tightening of her jaw when a movement caused her pain, the soft sigh of relief when he propped her up with a pillow. He saw the way she looked at the objects in his cabin, the way her gaze lingered on the maps on his wall, the worn books on his shelf, the simple tools he used for his daily tasks. He was an enigma to her, just as she was to him. One afternoon, as he was cleaning his rifle, she finally spoke, her voice a low, raspy sound. "Why?" It was a single word, but it hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "Why did you save me? Why did you help? Why am I here?" Cole stopped cleaning the rifle. He looked at her, and for the first time the full weight of his past and present converged. "I couldn't leave you to die," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't elaborate, didn't feel the need to. The truth was simple, brutal. He saw a mirror of his own past in her present, a reflection of the violence he had been a part of. Saving her was, in some small way, an attempt to save himself. She didn't press for more. Instead, she looked at the rifle in his hands, then at the deep, faded scar on his cheekbone. "Soldier," she whispered, her voice a statement, not a question. Cole nodded. "Used to be. Blue coat." Her term for the cavalry. It wasn't accusatory, just a plain fact. He was a representative of the people who had brought ruin to her world. "Yes," he said, his shame a bitter taste in his mouth. She closed her eyes, and a single tear, the first he had seen, slid down her bruised cheek. It wasn't a tear of pain, but of a profound, encompassing sadness. He didn't say anything, didn't try to comfort her. He knew he couldn't. He was a symbol of her grief. He was the enemy, and yet he was the one who had saved her. The paradox was as sharp and painful as a knife wound. As the days turned into a week, then two, Naheli slowly began to heal. Her movements became more fluid, her color returned. She began to help around the cabin in small ways, despite her broken arm. She showed him a trick for getting more heat from the stove, a way to mend a tear in his coat with a simple thread. She was teaching him without words, a silent transfer of knowledge. And as he watched her, as he saw the flicker of her spirit grow into a steady flame, he realized something. He had expected to see only scars, the physical ones, the emotional ones. But every time he looked at her, he saw something new. He saw the intricate pattern of her beadwork, the quiet grace in her movements, the depth of her eyes. He saw the resilience of her people, the beauty of a culture that refused to die. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was no longer alone in this desert. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet, almost domestic rhythm. It was a stark contrast to Cole's years of solitary existence. The cabin, once a place of silence and introspection, was now filled with the subtle sounds of two people coexisting. The soft rustle of Naheli's blanket as she shifted, the low murmur of her voice as she spoke to herself in Apache, the gentle crackle of the fire as she tended it. Cole found himself listening for these sounds, a strange comfort in their presence. Naheli's healing was a slow, deliberate process, mirroring the gradual erosion of the walls Cole had built around himself. The bruises on her face faded into a sickly yellow and then disappeared, revealing the delicate lines of her features. Her broken arm, though still in a sling fashioned from an old flour sack, was no longer a constant source of pain. Her limp was less pronounced, her strength returning with each passing day. Their relationship evolved into a strange, unspoken partnership. Cole would hunt and gather firewood, while Naheli, despite her limited mobility, took on the task of managing the cabin. She had an innate, almost magical understanding of the natural world. She showed him which roots were edible, how to tell when a storm was coming by the smell of the air, and how to track a deer by the faintest disturbance of the leaves. She was a living encyclopedia of the land, a wisdom that had been passed down through generations. One afternoon, as Cole returned with a rabbit, he found her sitting on the porch, her good hand working with a piece of leather. She had found a worn hide of a badger in a corner of the cabin and was meticulously cleaning it, her fingers moving with a practiced grace. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She didn't look up, her gaze focused on her work. "Making a bag," she said, her English still hesitant but more fluid now. "For medicine." Cole watched her, fascinated. She used a small, sharp stone he had overlooked to scrape the hide clean, her movements precise and efficient. She was a woman of two worlds, he realized. She spoke English, a skill she must have learned from a trader or a settler, yet her hands, her knowledge, and her spirit were deeply rooted in her Apache heritage. "You're a healer," he said, a statement of fact. She finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "I know some things," she said simply. "My grandmother taught me." He thought about the poultice she had been applying to her wounds, the bitter herbs he had seen her chew on for pain. It wasn't just a physical knowledge, but an ancient spiritual one. He was a man of the gun, of violence. She was a woman of the earth, of healing. The contrast was stark, yet somehow it fit. Their conversations were still sparse, but each word was a carefully chosen brick, building a foundation of trust. He learned her name was Naheli, which meant woods in Apache, a name that seemed fitting for a person so connected to the wild. He learned that she was from the Chiricahua band, that her village was a 2-day ride to the east, and that the men who had attacked her were not soldiers, but bounty hunters. "They wanted to sell me," she said one night, the words a raw whisper. Cole felt the cold fist of rage clench in his stomach. He had seen the slave trade in his days with the army, the cruel business of buying and selling human lives. He had thought it was a relic of the past, a dark chapter closed. He was wrong. The evil of man was a persistent weed, growing wherever it found a foothold. He didn't say anything, but he went outside and sat by the fire, his rifle resting on his knees. He cleaned it for the 10th time that day, the rhythmic motion a way to channel his fury. He had rescued her, but he knew the danger wasn't over. The bounty hunters would be back. They were like jackals, circling, waiting for an opportunity, and he was standing between them and their prize. He knew he couldn't keep her. He was a wanted man himself, a deserter from the army, living on the fringes of the law. His presence was a danger to her, but he couldn't let her go either. She was still weak, and the road to her village was long and treacherous. The bond between them had deepened, a silent, powerful thing. He saw her not as an Apache, an enemy, a stereotype, but as a person. He saw her dignity, her quiet strength, her wisdom. He expected to see only the scars of her beating, the physical and emotional trauma. But every day she showed him something new. She showed him her laughter, a soft musical sound that filled the cabin with warmth. She showed him her grief, a silent, private sorrow that she carried with a quiet grace. She showed him her hope, a small, persistent flame that refused to be extinguished. She was showing him the true beauty of a human being, a beauty that was not in the flesh, but in the spirit. He looked at her, sitting by the fire, her head bent over her work, her face serene in the flickering light. He realized he was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man with a purpose. He had been given a chance at redemption, a chance to do one thing right in a life filled with so much wrong. He didn't know how to protect her, how to get her home safely, but he knew he had to try, for her and for the man he wanted to be. The spring sun, warm and generous, finally chased away the last chill of winter from the high desert. With the change of seasons came a new kind of peace to the cabin. Nahele's health had improved dramatically. Her arm was fully healed, her limp all but gone. She moved with a silent, confident grace, her presence now a vibrant, undeniable part of Cole's life. Their conversations grew longer, stretching from simple observations about the weather to a slow, methodical sharing of their lives. Cole, a man of few words, found himself speaking more freely than he had in years. He told her about his life before the war, a simple, unremarkable existence on a farm in Illinois. He told her about the false promises that had lured him into the army, the naive belief that he was fighting for a just cause. He confessed his disillusionment, the bitter taste of betrayal that had driven him to this remote corner of the world. She listened with an unwavering stillness, her dark eyes never leaving his. She was a natural listener, her quiet attention a powerful force. When he was done, she would share a story from her own life, a tale of her people, of their traditions, their songs, and their connection to the land. She spoke of the Ya'ai sun as a living presence, of the Jiu mountains as the bones of their ancestors, and of the Tu water as the lifeblood of all things. Her words painted a picture of a world far richer and more complex than Cole had ever imagined. He had seen the Apache as a foe, a faceless enemy in a war he was told to win. Nahele was showing him they were a people, with a history, a culture, and a soul. She taught him the meaning of Apache words, a quiet lesson in a forgotten language. Ndine, man. Izdzan, woman. Wichani, dog. The words were melodic, a part of the rhythm of the land itself. She never spoke of the beating, of the men who had left her for dead. The trauma was there, a silent shadow that sometimes crossed her eyes, but she refused to let it define her. She had been a victim, but she was no longer. She was a survivor, and she was healing. One afternoon, as Cole was mending the fence, he saw her walking along the creek bed, her head bent low. She was singing, a low, haunting melody that carried on the breeze. It was a beautiful, sorrowful sound that spoke of loss and resilience. When she returned, she carried a handful of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of the desert. "What was the song?" Cole asked. She looked at the flowers in her hand, a soft smile on her lips. "A song for my people," she said. "A song to remember, to honor." He didn't ask her to elaborate. He didn't need to. The song, the flowers, her quiet strength, it was all part of the same story. Her story of a people who, despite all the violence and loss, still found a way to create beauty and find meaning. Cole had spent his life running from his past. He had tried to bury it in the desolate quiet of the desert, but Naheli was showing him a different way. She was teaching him that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about integrating the pain into the fabric of who you were. The scars didn't define you, but they were a part of your story. He found himself thinking about the bounty hunters, the men who had brutalized her. The thought of them was a sharp, cold presence in his mind. He knew he couldn't hide forever. The desert was vast, but it wasn't a fortress. Sooner or later, they would find her. And when they did, he knew he wouldn't hesitate. He was a man of peace now, but he was also a man who had not forgotten how to fight. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, they sat together on the porch, a silent companionship between them. The air was cool and crisp, a relief after the heat of the day. Cole found his gaze lingering on her face, the faint lines around her eyes, a testament to her quiet strength, the way her hair caught the last rays of light. He saw a beauty that was not fragile or fleeting, but deep and permanent. He had expected to see only scars, a symbol of brokenness. Instead, he saw a woman whose spirit was as vast and beautiful as the Arizona sky. He was no longer just a protector. He was a student, a man learning how to live again. The peace of the desert was an illusion, a fragile veneer over a world of constant threat. For several weeks, Cole and Naheli had lived in a bubble of quiet coexistence, a small, self-contained universe of two. But the outside world, with its cruelty and its greed, was beginning to encroach. Cole, ever vigilant, noticed the small signs first: a misplaced rock on the path leading to the spring, the faint, almost invisible tracks of a horse that were not his own, the nervous chatter of the desert birds, a sign that something was disturbing their routine. The knot of tension in his stomach tightened with each new discovery. He knew what it meant. They were being watched. He said nothing to Naheli at first, wanting to shield her from the fear. He went about his daily tasks with a renewed sense of urgency. He checked his traps, cleaned his rifle, and kept a careful eye on the horizon. His old instincts, the ones he had so desperately tried to bury, were now his only allies. He was a soldier again, but this time he was fighting a different kind of war. This time he had something to protect. One evening, as they were eating a simple meal of corncakes and jerky, a low-flying hawk circled the cabin, its cry sharp and insistent. Naheli looked up, her gaze following its flight. "They are coming," she said, her voice calm and resigned. Cole's hand stilled. He looked at her, and for the first time he saw the fear in her eyes. It was a fleeting thing, quickly masked by a profound sadness. She had been waiting for this. She had known the calm couldn't last. "How do you know?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She pointed to the hawk, then to the north, where a column of dust was just beginning to rise in the distance. "The hawk is a messenger," she said. "He warns us of danger, and the dust, a war party of pale men." Cole's heart pounded in his chest. A war party of pale men. She spoke of them with the same chilling neutrality he had heard from Apache scouts describing a band of raiders. He knew who they were, the bounty hunters. They had tracked her down. They were persistent, ruthless, and they wouldn't stop until they had their prize. He rose, his mind already racing. "We have to leave," he said. "Now." Naheli shook her head. "No," she said. "My people are in that direction. They will lead them to them." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "You must go." "I'm not leaving you," Cole said. The words a hard, unyielding truth. The thought of leaving her behind, of abandoning her to those men, was unbearable. He had saved her once. He would not fail her now. She didn't argue. She knew his resolve. Instead, she rose and went to the small leather bag she had made. She took out a pouch filled with a fine yellow powder. She held it out to him. "Pollen of the sacred corn," she explained. "It is for protection, for luck." Cole took the pouch, the soft leather surprisingly cool in his palm. He had never been a man for superstitions, but he took it. He had a feeling he would need all the luck he could get. He spent the next few hours fortifying the cabin. He boarded up the windows, checked his ammunition, and laid out his traps. The old soldier, dormant for so long, had been resurrected. He moved with a quiet, deadly efficiency, his mind focused on a single task: survival. Naheli worked alongside him, her movements a silent ballet of preparation. She filled water skins, packed a small sack of food, and sharpened a hunting knife she had kept hidden. She was not a warrior, but she was prepared to fight. Her resilience was not a passive thing. It was an active choice, a testament to her will to live. The sun set, and the desert was plunged into a deep velvety darkness. The air was still, heavy with a sense of foreboding. The distant dust cloud had settled, but Cole knew they were out there, waiting for nightfall. He had never been a religious man, but he found himself clutching the pouch of pollen, a strange comfort in its foreign weight. He sat on the porch, his rifle across his knees, watching the star-strewn sky. Nahele sat beside him, her presence a silent anchor in the storm. He had expected to see a broken woman, a victim marked by scars. He had expected to see a person who had given up. Instead, he saw a warrior, a healer, a soul as fierce and untamable as the wild desert itself. He saw a profound beauty that was not in her face but in her spirit. And he knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that he was no longer a man running from a ghost. He was a man standing his ground, fighting for a life he never knew he wanted. The war was coming and he was ready. The night was a vast, silent expanse, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Cole sat on the cabin's small porch, his senses on high alert. The wind had died down and the air was heavy, the scent of dust and juniper thick on the breeze. Nahele was inside, her breathing shallow and even as she rested. He watched the stars, a million tiny points of light, but his mind was on the shadows that danced at the edge of his vision. He knew they were there. He could feel their presence, a low, menacing hum in the silence. They came just before dawn, their approach silent and methodical. Cole saw the faint flicker of a light, a match being struck somewhere in the distance. Then another. They were encircling the cabin, a patient, deadly noose tightening around their necks. There were 3 of them, maybe 4. He couldn't be sure. They were professionals. He could tell from the way they moved, the calculated silence of their footsteps. They weren't outlaws. They were hunters. And he and Nahele were the prey. He felt the familiar cold certainty of a soldier going into battle. His heart rate slowed, his breathing deepened. He was no longer a civilian, a man of peace. He was an instrument of war, a well-oiled machine of destruction. He had spent years trying to forget this feeling, but now it was a welcome friend. It was the only thing that could keep them alive. He slipped inside the cabin, waking Nahele with a gentle touch. "They're here," he whispered. She was instantly awake, her eyes wide and alert. She didn't panic. She simply nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. They were in this together. Cole took a position by a small window, his rifle raised. The first shot came from the east, a sharp crack that splintered the wood of the cabin door. He saw a flash of light, the silhouette of a man moving in the darkness. He took aim and fired, the shot echoing in the stillness. He heard a sharp cry, a grunt of pain. He had hit one of them. He didn't know if he had killed him, but he knew he had made them wary. The men responded with a volley of shots, the bullets thudding into the logs, some piercing the walls and ricocheting off the stove. The cabin was too exposed, too vulnerable. They couldn't stay here. "We have to move," he said to Nahele. "There's a small storage cellar under the floorboards. We can hide there." Nahele shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I am not a ghost. I will not hide." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes. He had expected to find a woman broken by her ordeal, a person who would want nothing more than to cower in the darkness. He had expected to see only scars, but she was showing him a different kind of strength, a defiant spirit that refused to be silenced. She was not a victim. She was a warrior in her own right. "Then we fight," Cole said, his voice a low growl. The siege continued for hours. The men outside were patient, waiting for them to make a mistake. Cole would fire a shot and they would respond. He was a good shot, his aim honed by years of practice, but they were in the darkness, and he was in the light of the moon. It was a battle of attrition, and he knew they were at a disadvantage. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his shoulder. A bullet had grazed him, a hot, searing line of fire. He didn't cry out. He simply reloaded his rifle, his jaw tight. Nahele saw the blood, and her eyes widened in alarm. She moved to him, her hand touching his arm, a silent plea for him to stop. He pushed her away, gently but firmly. "I'm fine," he said. "Just stay low." She ignored him. She went to her satchel, and pulled out a small, sharp-pointed stone. She went to the front door and in the dim light of the moon began to carve a symbol into the wood. Cole watched her, a mixture of bewilderment and curiosity on his face. She was drawing a stylized hawk, its wings spread wide, its talons ready to strike. "What is that?" he asked. "A protector," she said, her voice a low murmur. "A Ya'ai spirit to watch over us. My people believe a hawk protects the home." Cole felt a strange warmth spread through him. It was an act of faith, a silent prayer, a belief in something beyond the mundane violence of their lives. It was an act of courage, a refusal to be defined by the fear. He had spent his life in the world of cold logic, of bullets and blood. She was showing him a world of spirit and faith, a world of true beauty. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in a soft, ethereal light, the shooting stopped. The men outside had withdrawn, but Cole knew they weren't gone. They were regrouping, waiting for their chance. The cabin was a wreck, the walls pockmarked with bullet holes, but they were alive. Cole looked at Nahele, at her face smudged with dirt and streaked with fear, but her eyes still holding that unyielding spark. He had expected to find only scars, but she had shown him a strength he had never known, a beauty that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with her soul. And he knew with a chilling certainty that he would not rest until she was safe. The silence that followed the siege was more menacing than the gunshots themselves. Cole knew it was a temporary truce, a moment for the bounty hunters to regroup and formulate a new plan. He couldn't risk staying. The cabin, once his sanctuary, was now a trap. "We have to go now," he said, his voice low and urgent. Nahele nodded. She had already packed the meager supplies they had, a few bags of jerky, a handful of corn, and their water skins. Cole took his rifle, a pouch of ammunition, and the small bag of corn pollen she had given him. It felt strange in his hand, a symbol of a faith he didn't share, but a comfort nonetheless. They slipped out of the cabin, moving into the vast, silent expanse of the desert. Cole led the way, his instincts honed by years of travel in unforgiving terrain. He moved with a practiced ease, his eyes scanning the horizon, his ears listening for the faintest sound. Nahele followed close behind, her footsteps light and silent. She was a natural in this environment, a part of the landscape itself. They traveled east, towards the mountains, towards the land where her people lived. The journey was long and arduous. The sun beat down on them, the air was dry and hot, and the ground was a relentless terrain of rock and sand. Cole was used to the hardship, but he worried about Nahele. She was still recovering, her strength not yet fully returned, but she surprised him at every turn. She never complained, never faltered. She showed him how to find water in the most unlikely of places, a small seep in a dry streambed, a patch of green moss on a north-facing rock. She pointed out the edible plants, a tiny bulbous root, a sweet berry from a wild bush. She was a walking guide to survival, her knowledge a testament to the resilience of her people. As they walked, they talked. Cole had never been a man to share his thoughts, but now he found himself pouring out his heart to her. He spoke of the war, the countless raids, the senseless violence he had witnessed. He confessed his shame, the guilt that had been a constant companion for years. He expected her to be angry, to hate him, but she listened with a quiet patience, her gaze steady and unwavering. "My people also have a saying," she said one night, as they sat around a small fire. "The past is a snake that bites us when we look back. We must walk forward." Cole looked at her, and he saw the profound wisdom in her words. She was not asking him to forget. She was asking him to live. She had been through so much, and yet she had not let the bitterness consume her. She had chosen to walk forward, to find beauty and purpose in a world that had tried to take everything from her. The next day they were forced to hide. Cole had spotted 2 riders on the horizon, their movements slow and methodical. They were searching for them. They had a tracker, he knew. He and Nahele scrambled into a small rocky ravine, hiding beneath a cluster of jagged rocks. They lay there for hours, the sun beating down on them, their bodies aching with the strain. Cole was on high alert, his rifle in his hands, his finger on the trigger. Nahele was as still as a statue, her body relaxed, her breathing even. She wasn't afraid. She was a part of the landscape, a shadow in the sun. He looked at her, and he felt a profound sense of awe. She had been through so much, and yet she was still so whole. She had been beaten, left for dead, and yet She radiated a quiet, unyielding strength. He expected to see only scars, but she had shown him a different kind of beauty, a beauty that was born of resilience, of a spirit that refused to be broken. As the sun began to set, the riders finally moved on. Cole and Naheli emerged from their hiding place, their bodies stiff and sore. They walked in silence for a while, the air cool and crisp on their skin. The stars were beginning to appear, a blanket of 1,000,000 lights across the velvet black sky. Cole looked at her, and he felt a new kind of emotion. Not pity, not responsibility, but something deeper, a profound respect. He had seen a lot of people in his life, but he had never met anyone like her. She was a testament to the power of the human spirit. She was a living symbol of true beauty. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would not rest until he had gotten her home, until she was safe among her people. The journey continued, a relentless march across the sun-scorched earth. Cole's sense of urgency grew with each passing day. He knew the bounty hunters were still on their trail, a relentless evil force lurking just out of sight. They were closer now, their tracks fresher, their pursuit more aggressive. Cole and Naheli were no longer just walking. They were running, a desperate race against time. The stress of the constant flight began to take its toll. Cole's wounds, though minor, ached with a dull, persistent pain. He was running on pure adrenaline, his body and mind pushed to their limits. Naheli, despite her remarkable resilience, was also showing signs of fatigue. Her limp had returned, a slight but noticeable drag of her right leg. One afternoon they came to a high ridge, and Cole stopped, his body tense. He had heard something, the faint rhythmic thump of horses' hooves. They were close, too close. He pulled Naheli down behind a cluster of boulders, his hand over her mouth. They lay there, their bodies pressed against the hard rock, listening. The sound grew louder, closer. They were a small, vulnerable island in a sea of danger. Cole peered over the edge of the boulder, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw them, 3 men on horseback, their faces grim, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They were the same men who had attacked Naheli. He saw the cold, predatory look in their eyes. They were not just after the money, they were after the hunt, the kill. Naheli's body was tense beside him, her breathing shallow and ragged. He could feel her fear, a cold, tangible thing. He knew he had to act. He had 2 choices: surrender and hope they were merciful, or fight and risk everything. He chose to fight. He would not let them take her, not after all they had been through. He raised his rifle, his hand steady. He had a clear shot at the lead rider. It would be a clean kill. He took a deep breath, his finger on the trigger. He had killed men before, countless men. He had thought he was done with it, that he had left that part of his life behind. But now, it was back. The past had finally caught up to him. He was about to pull the trigger when Naheli's hand closed over his, her grip surprisingly strong. She shook her head, her eyes wide with a silent plea. "No," she whispered. Cole looked at her, a mixture of bewilderment and frustration on his face. "They will kill us," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "Then let them," she said, her voice filled with a terrible, quiet dignity. "This is not your fight." He stared at her, the words a cold shock to his system. She was willing to die to protect him, to save him from becoming the man he had once been. He had expected to find a woman who was broken, who wanted nothing more than revenge. He had expected to see only scars. But she was showing him a different kind of bravery, a strength that was not born of violence but of peace. She was a warrior of the spirit, not of the gun. He lowered his rifle, the weight of it suddenly heavy in his hands. He looked at the men on the ridge, their forms slowly disappearing from view. He had a choice to make. He could continue to fight, to kill, to become the monster he had so desperately tried to outrun, or he could listen to her, to the woman who had taught him what it meant to be human again. He chose her. He chose to walk away from the violence, to put down the gun. The men rode on, their footsteps fading into the distance. Cole knew they would be back. They would not give up. But for now they were safe. He looked at Naheli, at her face, streaked with dust and tears, but her eyes filled with a profound sense of relief. He had expected to find only scars, but she had shown him a new kind of beauty, a beauty that was not in her face, but in her soul, a beauty that had healed him, a beauty that had given him a new life. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man walking towards a future he never knew he wanted. The last leg of the journey was the most difficult. The bounty hunters, relentless in their pursuit, were always just a step behind. Cole and Nahele had to move constantly, traveling at night and hiding during the day. Their food and water supplies were running low and their bodies ached with exhaustion. But they were close. Cole could feel it. The air was different here, the scent of pine and rich earth, a welcome contrast to the dry, dusty air of the desert. The mountains, vast and imposing, loomed in the distance, a silent promise of home. One evening, as they were making their way through a dense thicket of juniper trees, Cole heard the sound of voices, not the cold, menacing voices of the bounty hunters, but a low, melodic murmur of a language he now recognized. Apache. He pulled Nahele close, his hand on her shoulder. "Listen," he whispered. She stiffened, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She listened, her head tilted, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. It was the first time Cole had seen her truly, unreservedly happy. "My people," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We are home." They followed the sound of the voices, pushing through the thorny bushes and over the rocky terrain. They came to a clearing, and Cole stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Before them was a small, hidden village. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and cooking food. Children were laughing, their voices ringing with pure joy. Women were tending to fires, their faces etched with a deep sense of peace. Men were sitting around a campfire, their faces a tapestry of strength and wisdom. It was a world Cole had only heard about, a world of peace and community, a world that was a stark contrast to the violence and chaos he had known. Nahele, without a word, broke free from his grasp and ran towards the village. She was no longer the wounded, broken woman he had found in the desert. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend returning home. A young woman saw her, and a cry of joy erupted from her. The cry was quickly followed by others, and soon the entire village was in an uproar. People came running towards her, their faces filled with a profound, almost spiritual sense of relief. Cole stood in the shadows, his presence an alien thing in this place. He was a white man, a former soldier. He was an outsider, an enemy. He watched as Nahele was embraced, as she was pulled into the warm, welcoming circle of her family. He saw the tears of joy, the cries of relief, the profound sense of belonging. He had brought her home. His job was done. He turned to leave, his heart a mixture of a bittersweet sense of accomplishment and a sharp, aching loneliness. He had saved her, but he was still a ghost in the desert, a man without a place to call home. He had taken 2 steps when he heard a voice. "Wait." He turned. It was Nahele. She was standing a few feet away from him, her hand outstretched. Her face, a moment ago filled with pure joy, was now filled with a deep, compelling concern. "Come," she said. "You are not a ghost anymore. You are a friend." Cole looked at her, at the hand she had extended. He had spent years running from his past, trying to outrun the demons that haunted him. He had thought that solitude was his only sanctuary. But in this one woman, he had found something he had never expected. He had found a new kind of family, a new kind of home. He had expected to see only scars, but she had shown him a world of true beauty. He had expected to find a woman who was broken, but he had found a warrior of the spirit, a person who had healed his own wounded soul. He took a step forward, then another. He took her hand, his rough, calloused palm a stark contrast to her soft, delicate one. He had come to the desert to die, but he had found a new reason to live. He had a long way to go to earn their trust, but he was ready to try. He had walked into the desert as a soldier, but he was walking into the village as a man, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that his journey had just begun. The firelight danced on the faces of the Apache people, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief, curiosity, and a deep-seated wariness. Nahele's return was a moment of profound joy, a miracle they had scarcely dared to hope for. She was a daughter of this land, a piece of their community that had been lost and was now found. But Cole, the silent, armed man who stood in the shadows beside her, was a symbol of a different kind. He was a Chishi white man, a former bluecoat cavalryman, and the very people he had once sworn to serve had brought so much pain and death to their world. Nahele's embrace with her family was a sight Cole had only ever imagined in his lonely solitude. He watched as her mother, a woman with a face as lined as a dried riverbed, clung to her, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. A tall, stoic man, her father, grasped her shoulders, his eyes a mixture of pride and a quiet, terrible sorrow for what she had endured. A younger brother, a boy with quick, intelligent eyes, simply stood and stared at her, as if afraid she might vanish. Naheli finally turned, her hand still clasped by her mother's, and she looked at Cole. Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of deep, compassionate understanding. She knew the chasm that existed between him and her people, a gap of history, of violence, of fear. She spoke in her native tongue, a rush of words that were as familiar as a song to her people, yet completely alien to Cole. He watched as the heads of the elders, their faces as wrinkled and wise as the mountains themselves, turned to look at him. Their eyes were piercing, assessing, and unreadable. He could not tell if they saw an enemy, a friend, or something in between. Nahil's father, a man named Hane Arrow, stepped forward. He was tall and wiry, with a gaze as sharp as the point of his name. His eyes, fixed on Cole, were a testament to a life of hardship and vigilance. Naheli spoke to him, and Hane listened, his expression never changing. Cole stood still, his hands at his sides, his rifle slung over his shoulder, a physical extension of his past life that he could not yet abandon. Hane finally spoke in slow, deliberate English, his voice a low rumble. "You are the one who saved her." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Cole nodded. "I am." Hane's gaze shifted to the rifle, then back to Cole's eyes. "You were a soldier." "Yes," Cole said, his voice flat. He offered no excuses, no justifications. He had long since run out of them. Hane took a long moment to respond, his eyes searching Cole's. The silence was thick, filled with the weight of generations of conflict. "You have brought a good daughter back to her people. For that we owe you a great debt." He looked at Naheli, who nodded, a silent confirmation. "But a Chishi in our village is like a coyote in a hen house. We must watch." Cole understood. It was a conditional welcome, a truce, not a full-fledged acceptance. It was more than he had a right to expect. Naheli's grandmother, a woman named Astzaan, came forward. Her face was a gentle, intricate web of wrinkles, her eyes kind, but knowing. She looked at Cole and then at Nahele, and she spoke in English, her voice surprisingly strong. "He is no longer a soldier," she said, her words a quiet authority. "He is a man, and a man is judged by his heart, not by his clothes." Asdzaan's words seemed to settle the matter for now. The tension in the air eased slightly. Naheli's younger brother, the boy with the sharp eyes, came up to Cole and touched his rifle, then looked at him with a silent, questioning curiosity. Cole simply nodded, and the boy, no longer afraid, gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. That first night, Cole was given a simple blanket and a spot by the fire, a respectful distance from the family. He ate a meal of roasted meat and corn cakes, a food so simple and yet so nourishing, a stark contrast to the tasteless jerky he had subsisted on for weeks. He watched the villagers, their easy laughter, their quiet conversations. He saw a community that had been pushed to the edge, that had faced unimaginable hardships, and yet they had held on. They were a people who had a powerful, enduring sense of themselves. He saw the children running, the men laughing as they spoke of a hunt, the women weaving intricate baskets. He was an observer, an alien in a world that was both foreign and profoundly beautiful. He had spent his life running from the past, trying to bury his shame in the desolate quiet of the desert. But Naheli had led him to a place where the past was not forgotten, but it was not allowed to define the future. He looked across the fire at Naheli, who was sitting with her family, her face radiating a quiet joy. Her mother was braiding her hair, her father was telling her a story, and her brother was sitting close by, listening intently. She had been through so much, and yet she was whole. She had been beaten, left for dead, and yet she had returned home. She was a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Cole closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire a gentle heat on his face. He had expected to see only scars, a symbol of brokenness. Instead, he had found a new life. He was a man without a home, a man without a people. But tonight, for the first time in years, he was not alone. The journey had ended, but a new one had just begun. The morning brought with it a different kind of reality. The joy of Naheli's return was still present, a warm undercurrent in the village's daily life, but Cole's presence remained a point of tension. He was an unknown quantity, a variable they could not trust. The bluecoat who had once hunted them was now a guest, and the irony was lost on no one. Cole spent the morning in quiet observation. He watched as the men of the village sharpened their spears and arrows, a quiet, deliberate preparation for the day's hunt. He saw the women tend to the corn and the squash, their movements a slow, rhythmic dance. He was a silent observer, a man on the fringes of a world he did not yet belong to. Nahele approached him, her gait easy, her spirit lighter now that she was home. She was wearing a beautifully beaded dress, the colors of the desert and the sky woven into a vibrant pattern. "You must eat," she said, her voice soft. He took the bowl of corn porridge she offered, his eyes on the village. "The bounty hunters," he said, his voice low. "They will be back. They are not men who give up easily." Nahele's smile faded. "My father, Hane, will speak with the council." "They must understand," Cole said, his voice urgent. "They will not come with a war party. They are trackers, hunters. They will come in small groups waiting for the right moment. They are ghosts." Nahele nodded, a grim understanding in her eyes. She knew the kind of men they were. She had seen their cruelty firsthand. She went to her father, and he listened, his face impassive. He then went to the council fire where the elders and the warriors of the village were gathered. Cole waited, the minutes stretching into an eternity. He was a man who knew the language of violence, the tactics of war. He knew the bounty hunters would not be swayed by a peace offering or a diplomatic gesture. They understood only one language, the language of the gun. He had spent his life trying to escape that language, but now it was his only tool. The council's conversation was a slow, deliberate murmur. Cole could hear their low voices, the rhythmic cadence of their language. He saw Hane pointing in the direction of the desert, his hands illustrating the movement of the bounty hunters. He saw the elders listen, their faces a mixture of skepticism and concern. A young warrior, a man with a fierce gaze and a powerful build, rose and walked towards Cole. He was a Ende, Apache man, who had seen his share of Chishi violence. His name was Goyaweye, he who watches. He looked at Cole with an open suspicion. "You tell the council that men are coming?" Goyaweye said in halting English. Cole nodded. "I know them. They are not soldiers. They will not announce themselves. They will come in the dark." Goyaweye's gaze lingered on Cole's rifle, a symbol of everything he hated. "Why should we believe you? You are a Chishi. Your people have spoken many lies." Cole held his gaze. "I am not my people," he said, the words a hard, unyielding truth. "And I do not lie. I saw what they did to Nahele. They left her for dead." Goyaweye's eyes hardened. He looked at Nahele, who was standing a short distance away, her face solemn. The memory of her pain was a powerful, unspoken force. Cole took a step closer, his voice low. "I am not a soldier anymore. I am a man who wants to do one thing right in a life full of wrong. I came here to help her. And I will help you. They will not stop until they have what they want. They will not rest, we must be ready." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Goyaweye did not respond. He simply turned and walked back to the council fire, his footsteps silent on the packed earth. Cole watched as Goyaweye spoke to the elders, his words a translation of Cole's warning. The elders listened, their expressions still unreadable, but the young warrior's words had a different kind of weight. He was one of them. He had no reason to lie. Just then a scout, a young man who had been out since dawn, came running into the village, his face grim. He spoke in a rush of words, his voice filled with urgency. He pointed to the north, his hand trembling. The village went quiet. The elders rose, their faces now filled with a profound sense of foreboding. Hane walked to Cole, his gaze now filled with a new kind of respect. "The scout," he said, his voice grave. "He has seen their sign. 3 men. They are close." Cole nodded, the feeling of dread a cold knot in his stomach. The ghosts of his past were not just a memory, they were a reality. They had followed him to the one place he had hoped to find peace. But he was no longer alone. He had Nahele, and he had a village of people who were now facing the same enemy he was. He was no longer a ghost in the desert. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a new home, and a man who would fight to the death to protect it. The village was a hive of activity. Cole's warning, now confirmed by their own scout, had galvanized the community. The men, young and old, prepared for the coming conflict. They sharpened their knives, checked their bows, and prepared their spears. The women and children moved to a more defensible position at the heart of the village, their faces filled with a quiet, determined courage. Cole was not yet fully accepted, but he was no longer an outcast. He was a man with a valuable skill, a knowledge of the enemy that no one else possessed. Hane, Nahele's father, had appointed him to work alongside Goyaweye, the young warrior who had been so suspicious of him. It was a test of trust, a challenge that Cole knew he had to meet. Their task was to scout the perimeter, to find the best place to set up a defense. Goyaweye was silent and wary, his movements as fluid and graceful as a shadow. He moved through the brush with an ease that Cole, despite his training, could only envy. He was a part of this land, a son of the desert. Cole, on the other hand, was an outsider, a man of the gun, a man of straight lines and predictable patterns. They walked in a strained silence for a long time, the tension between them a physical presence. Goyaweye pointed to a narrow pass, a perfect choke point for an ambush. "Here," he said, his voice flat. "The enemy can only come one way." Cole looked at the pass and then at the surrounding terrain. "No," he said, his voice low. "They will not use the obvious path. They are hunters, not soldiers. They will flank us. They will come from the high ground, where they can see everything." Goyaweye looked at him, his eyes filled with a flash of anger. "You speak as if you know them." "I do," Cole said, his voice a hard, unyielding truth. "I have seen men like them before. They do not fight with honor. They fight to win. They will use the sun to blind us, the wind to cover their tracks." Goyawaye's gaze lingered on Cole's face, a mixture of disbelief and a grudging respect. Cole was not speaking from a textbook, he was speaking from experience. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity, a man who had learned the hard way how to survive. They moved to the high ground, a rocky outcrop with a clear view of the surrounding terrain. Cole used a small spyglass he had carried with him for years, a relic of his army days. He scanned the horizon, his heart pounding in his chest. He was searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of light, any misplaced shadow. Suddenly, Goyawaye's hand shot out, his fingers closing around Cole's arm. He pointed to a small, almost imperceptible disturbance in the dust far below. "Look," he whispered. "Chishi sign." Cole looked through the spyglass. He saw them. 3 men on horseback, their bodies low, their movements a slow, methodical advance. They were not following the main trail. They were moving exactly as Cole had predicted, through the treacherous, rocky terrain of the high ground, a perfect vantage point for an ambush. Goyawaye's eyes widened. He looked at Cole with a new kind of respect, a silent acknowledgement that Cole had been right. Cole had not come to them with a lie. He had come to them with the truth. "They are here," Goyaweye said, his voice a low, grim whisper. Cole nodded. "We have to warn the village. Now." They moved with a speed that belied their exhaustion, their bodies a blur of motion. They came to the village, their faces grim. Hane and the elders were waiting, their expressions filled with a profound sense of foreboding. Goyaweye spoke first, his voice filled with an uncharacteristic urgency. He was right. They are coming from the high ground. They are coming to kill us. The elders looked at Cole, their faces now filled with a grudging respect. He was not a savior, not a hero. He was a man with a dark past, a man who had seen the face of evil, and a man who could now help them fight it. The walls of suspicion that had surrounded him were finally beginning to crumble. He was no longer a Chishi ghost. He was a man, a friend, an ally, and in a world filled with enemies. That was all that mattered. That night, Cole was invited to the council fire. It was not a grand ceremony, but a simple, solemn gathering of the village's leaders. The elders, their faces a roadmap of a lifetime of hardship and wisdom, sat in a semicircle around the fire. Nahele's father, Haneye, was there, his expression a mixture of caution and a new kind of trust. Goyaweye, the young warrior who had seen the bounty hunters with his own eyes, sat beside him, his gaze a silent confirmation of Cole's words. Cole was given a place at the edge of the circle, an outsider invited to a sacred space. He sat, his back straight, his hands on his knees, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He knew this was his final test, his chance to earn their trust, to become more than just a temporary ally. An old man, his face a web of wrinkles, his eyes as dark and deep as the night sky, spoke first. He was the head elder, a man named Chiniwi, he who knows. His voice was a low rumble, the words spoken in his native tongue. Nahele, who was sitting with her family nearby, translated for Cole, her voice a soft whisper in the silence. "He asks," Nahele said, "who you are, not the name you were given at birth, but the name you have earned. He asks you to speak your truth." Cole took a deep breath. He had thought about this moment for a long time. He had no excuses left, no lies to tell. He could only speak from the heart, a language he had forgotten how to use. "My name is Ethan Colton," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "I was a soldier, a bluecoat." He saw the elders stiffen, their faces turning to stone. "I was sent to fight your people, to make you leave this land. I did as I was told. I saw things that haunt my dreams. A village burned, a family killed. I was a part of it. I was a part of the evil." Nahele's whisper was even softer as she translated, her words a quiet echo of his shame. The elders listened, their expressions unreadable. Cole continued, his voice a low confession. "I left the army. I ran from my past. I came to this desert to be a ghost. I wanted to forget, but a man cannot forget his own soul." He looked at Nahele, his gaze filled with a profound, unspoken gratitude. "And then I found her. She was a mirror. She showed me the scars of what I had been a part of. And she showed me something else. She showed me a different kind of strength, a strength that was not born of a gun, but of a spirit that refused to be broken." He looked back at the elders, his eyes filled with a raw, unvarnished truth. "I have nothing to offer you, only my rifle, only my knowledge, and a promise that I will fight for you. I will fight for her. I will not rest until those men are gone. I am not a man who can bring you peace. I am a man who can only bring you a chance to fight for your own." The silence that followed was long and profound. Chiniwi sat, his eyes closed, his face a calm, deep sea of contemplation. Then he opened his eyes. He spoke in his native tongue, his voice a low, melodic sound. "He says," Nahele translated, her voice filled with a quiet emotion, "that a man who can speak his shame is a man who can begin to heal. The land knows your pain. The wind knows your secrets. But the heart of a man is a place that only he can tend to." Chiniwi rose, and he walked to Cole. He looked at him, and then he did something that shocked Cole to his core. He reached out and placed his hand on Cole's shoulder. It was a gesture of profound acceptance, a silent acknowledgement that Cole was no longer an enemy, but a man seeking redemption. "He says," Nahele continued, "that you are a son of the earth now, and the earth will either bury you or heal you." Cole felt the weight of the hand on his shoulder, a physical manifestation of a trust he had not yet earned. He was a man who had killed, a man who had run from his past. But tonight, he was a man who had been offered a chance at a new life. He looked at Nahele, at her face, filled with a quiet hope. He had expected to see only scars, but she had shown him a different kind of beauty, a beauty that was born of a profound compassion, a wisdom that was as old as the mountains themselves. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would not rest until he had earned their trust. The morning after the council meeting, Cole was given a new task. He was to go on a hunting trip with Goyawe, the young warrior who had been so suspicious of him. It was a test, a way for Cole to prove his worth, to show that his knowledge was not just a trick, but a skill that could benefit the community. The air was crisp and cool as they made their way into the mountains. Goyawe moved with a silent, fluid grace, his senses a part of the landscape. He pointed to a faint track in the dust, the almost imperceptible mark of a deer. He bent down, his hand touching the ground, his eyes reading the story of the animal's journey. Cole, despite his years of experience, was a blunt instrument in comparison. He was a man of the gun, of power, of brute force. Goyawe was a man of the earth, of patience, of subtle understanding. They walked in silence for a long time, the tension between them a silent presence. Cole was a man who had learned to read the land from a map, from a textbook. Goyawe was a man who had learned to read the land with his heart. Suddenly, Goyawe stopped, his body tense. He held up a hand, a silent signal. Cole stopped as well, his senses on high alert. He heard nothing, he saw nothing, but Goyawe was looking up, his gaze fixed on a high ridge in the distance. "What is it?" Cole whispered. Goyawe didn't answer. He simply moved to a small rocky outcrop, his body a blur of motion. Cole followed, his rifle in his hands. Goyaway took out a small pair of binoculars, a relic of a past raid, and peered through them. He swore under his breath in Apache. "What is it?" Cole asked again. Goyaway handed him the binoculars. Cole looked through them, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw them. 3 men on horseback, their bodies low, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They were not bounty hunters. They were soldiers, bluecoats. "Why are they here?" Cole whispered. "They do not hunt animals," Goyaway said, his voice grim. "They hunt us." Cole knew the answer. The army had been hunting him for years, a deserter from the war. And now they were here in the heart of the Apache lands. They had either been sent to find him, or they were a patrol, a scouting party, looking for a sign of the village. Either way, they were a threat. He looked at Goyaway, at his face, filled with a cold, unforgiving rage. Cole had left the army, but the army had not left him. The ghosts of his past had followed him to the one place he had hoped to find peace. "We have to warn the village," Cole said, his voice low and urgent. Goyaway nodded. He was no longer suspicious. He was a man who had seen the truth. They were not facing a single enemy, but a multitude of them. The bounty hunters were a threat, but the army was a force of nature, an enemy that could not be reasoned with, an enemy that would not rest until they had what they wanted. They moved with a silent, efficient grace, their bodies a blur of motion as they made their way back to the village. The hunt was forgotten. The deer was forgotten. They were no longer hunters. They were warriors, and they were fighting for their lives. They came to the village, their faces grim. Haneke and the elders were waiting. Goyaway spoke first, his voice a low, urgent murmur. He spoke of the soldiers, of their numbers, of their intent. The village went quiet. The children stopped playing. The women stopped their work. The air was filled with a sense of profound foreboding. The bounty hunters were a threat, but the army was a force that had brought so much pain and death to their world. Cole stepped forward, his body tense. "I am a deserter," he said, his voice low. "They will be looking for me. I am a danger to you. I can leave. I can lead them away from here." Ane looked at him, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You are one of us now. We will face them together." Cole felt a surge of emotion. He had expected to be cast out, to be shunned, to be sent back into the desert to face his past alone. But they had chosen to trust him. They had chosen to stand with him. He was no longer a ghost in the desert. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a home, a man with a family, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would not rest until he had earned their trust. The news of the army's proximity had cast a heavy shadow over the village. The laughter of the children was quieter, the conversations of the elders more subdued. The threat of the bounty hunters was a storm on the horizon, but the army was a force of nature, a thundercloud that was about to break. Cole and Naheli spent the day in a shared silence, their bond a quiet anchor in the coming storm. They went to the river, a place of peace and solitude, a small stream that flowed from the mountains, its water cool and clear. They sat on the bank, their bodies close, their hands almost touching. Cole finally spoke, his voice a low murmur. "I am sorry," he said. Naheli looked at him, her eyes filled with a gentle, questioning look. "For what?" "For bringing them here," he said. "The army. They are looking for me. I am a danger to you. I should have left." Naheli shook her head, her hand finally reaching out and touching his. "You did not bring them. They would have come anyway. They are a sickness on the land. They do not need a reason to hurt us." He looked at her face filled with a quiet strength, a profound compassion. "You have been through so much," he said. "I have seen the way you look at the stars, the way you listen to the wind. You have a spirit that is as vast as this land, and I have brought you nothing but danger." Naheli looked out at the river, her gaze fixed on the water as it flowed over the rocks. "My grandmother has a saying," she said. "The river does not stop for the stones, it flows around them. It is the same with life. The pain is a stone, we do not stop for it. We flow around it." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a soft, undeniable affection. "You did not bring me pain. You brought me life. You brought me home. You showed me that there is still good in the world. You showed me that a Chishi can have a heart." Cole felt a surge of emotion, a feeling so raw and so deep it took his breath away. He had spent his life in a world of violence, of hate, of fear. He had expected to see only scars, but she had shown him a different kind of beauty, a beauty that was not in her body, but in her soul, a beauty that had healed him, a beauty that had given him a reason to live. He took her hand, his rough, calloused palm a stark contrast to her soft, delicate one. He looked at her, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he loved her. He had no words for it, no way to express the profound depth of his feelings. It was an unspoken bond, a silent promise. "I will not let them hurt you," he said, his voice a low, fierce whisper. "I will not let them touch this village. I will fight for you. I will die for you." Nahele squeezed his hand. "You do not have to die for me," she said. "You just have to live for me." He looked at her, and he saw a world of hope in her eyes. She was not just a woman he had saved. She was a woman who had saved him. She had saved him from himself, from the darkness that had consumed his soul. She had given him a new life, a new purpose. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief after the heat of the day. They sat in silence, their hands clasped, their bodies a single quiet presence in the vast silent expanse of the desert. The storm was coming, the air was thick with it, but for now they were in a place of peace, a place of hope, a place of love. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Cole felt truly, completely home. The village was on high alert. The council, after a tense meeting, had decided against fleeing. To run was to show weakness, to become a constant prey. They would stand and fight. Cole's military knowledge, once an unwanted curse, was now their most valuable asset. He stood with the elders and the warriors, advising them on strategy, on tactics, on how to defend their home. He drew a map in the dirt with a stick, showing them the paths the soldiers would likely take, the places they would set up an ambush, the high ground they would use for a vantage point. He spoke of flanking maneuvers, of pincer movements, of the brutal efficiency of a trained army. He was a bluecoat in the heart of an Apache village, and he was teaching them how to fight his own people. The irony was not lost on him, and it was a bitter, painful thing. "They will come with a scout in front," he explained, his voice low. "He will be a tracker. We must deal with him first. If we can get to him, we can make them think we are in the wrong place. We can lead them into our trap." Goyaway, the young warrior, listened intently. He had come to see Cole as a teacher, a man who spoke with the authority of experience. The suspicion he had once felt was gone, replaced by a quiet, professional respect. "And the bounty hunters?" Goyaway asked. "Where are they?" Cole looked at him, his face grim. "They are like jackals. They will wait for the army to do the hard work. They will come in the confusion. They will come for Nahele." The mention of her name sent a cold shiver down Cole's spine. He had to protect her. He had to keep her safe. She was the one he was fighting for, the one he had chosen to live for. The tribal leaders listened to Cole's plan, their faces a mixture of solemnity and a deep, enduring pride. They were not a people who went to war easily, but they were a people who would defend their home to the death. As the sun began to set, the air was filled with a sense of quiet foreboding. The children were sent to a hidden cave deep in the mountains, a secret place that had been used for generations in times of war. The women, old and young, gathered their tools, their hands now holding bows and spears. They were not just mothers and wives, they were warriors. Nahele was among them, her face serene, her movements calm and deliberate. She had chosen to stay and fight. She had chosen to stand with her people. She looked at Cole, and a silent understanding passed between them. They were in this together. Cole took his place at the edge of the village, his rifle in his hands, his eyes on the horizon. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man facing it, a man ready to fight for a new life. The army was a symbol of all the violence and injustice he had seen, and the bounty hunters were a symbol of a greed and cruelty that knew no bounds. He was ready to face them both. The night was long and silent, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Cole sat in the darkness, his mind a quiet, focused machine. He thought of his life before, the years of anger and solitude. He thought of the man he had been and the man he was becoming. He had come to this desert to die, but he had found a reason to live. He had found a reason to fight. He looked at the moon, a pale, silent observer in the vast expanse of the night. He had a feeling it would be the last peaceful night for a long time. The storm was coming. The gathering clouds of war were on the horizon. But Cole was ready. He was no longer just a man. He was a warrior of the earth, a protector of a people he had once been taught to hate. He had found his purpose, and he would not let go. The dawn came, not with a gentle light, but with the sharp crack of a rifle. The bounty hunters had come first, their attack a brutal and calculated ambush from the high ground. They were not soldiers, they were murderers. They had no regard for honor, no regard for life. They simply wanted the prize. Cole was in his position, his rifle aimed at a small rocky outcrop. He saw the flash of light, the silhouette of a man. He fired, the shot echoing in the stillness. He heard a sharp cry, a grunt of pain. He had hit his target. He didn't stop to think. He reloaded his rifle, his movements a blur of practiced efficiency. The village erupted into chaos. The Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, returned fire. Arrows flew through the air, their fletching a silent, deadly whistle. The village was a fortress, a place where the people, once peaceful, were now warriors. Cole fought with a cold, focused fury. He was no longer just a man. He was an instrument of war, a well-oiled machine of destruction. He had spent years trying to forget this feeling, but now it was his only ally. He was fighting for Naheli, for her family, for her people. He was no longer fighting for a cause he did not believe in. He was fighting for his home. The bounty hunters were a brutal enemy. They were ruthless, their attacks a vicious, calculated assault. They had no regard for the lives of the women and children. They only wanted to get to their prize. Cole saw the leader, a man with a scarred face and a cruel smile. He was a man who had left Naheli for dead. He was a man who had no soul. He was a man Cole wanted to kill. He raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger. He had a clear shot. He could end this now. But a voice, a small, quiet voice in his head stopped him. It was Naheli's voice. "You just have to live for me." She had asked him not to kill, not to become the monster he had once been. He had made a promise. He had chosen a new path. He lowered his rifle. He would not kill. He would not become a murderer. He would only fight to protect. The battle raged for hours. The bounty hunters were relentless, their attacks a constant, brutal assault. But the Apache warriors were tenacious. They knew this land. They were a part of it. They fought with a knowledge, a grace, a skill that Cole had never seen. Cole fought alongside Goyawe, the young warrior now a trusted friend. They were a team, a combination of brute force and quiet efficiency. They moved together, their movements a silent, deadly dance. Cole was a soldier, but he was also a man, and in the heat of battle, he was fighting for more than just survival. He was fighting for his soul. He was fighting for a chance at a new life. He was fighting for her. The battle ended as it had begun, with a sudden, silent pause. The bounty hunters, beaten and broken, had retreated. They had not been prepared for the ferocity of the Apache defense. They had not been prepared for a bluecoat who was willing to fight to the death for a people he had once been taught to hate. The village was a mess. There were wounded and there were dead. The price of victory was a heavy one. Cole, his body aching, his hands trembling, looked at the carnage. He saw the faces of the dead, men who had come to kill, men who had been killed. He saw the faces of the living, their eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and a deep, profound relief. He saw Naheli, her face covered in soot, her hands tending to a wounded man. She looked at him, and her eyes, filled with a raw, unvarnished emotion, were a silent confirmation. They had won. They were safe, for now. He had expected to see only scars, but she had shown him a different kind of beauty, a beauty that was not in her face, but in her soul, a beauty that had saved him from himself. The aftermath of the battle was a somber and solemn affair. The village had suffered losses, but they had won. The bounty hunters, a brutal and cruel force, had been beaten back. Their leader, the man with the scarred face, lay dead on the outskirts of the village, a testament to the ferocity of the Apache defense. The village was bruised, but it was not broken. It was a testament to the resilience of a people who had faced so much and had still found a way to survive. Cole, his body aching, his mind reeling from the violence, sat by the fire, a solitary figure in the midst of a community that was mourning its dead and celebrating its victory. He had a shallow gash on his arm, a painful but not life-threatening wound. He was a soldier in a village of warriors, a man who had chosen to fight for a new life. Naheli came to him, her face filled with a quiet concern. She sat beside him, her presence a silent, comforting anchor. She took his arm, her hands gentle as she cleaned the wound. She applied a poultice of herbs, the scent of the wild desert plants a soothing balm on his skin. "You fought for us," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I fought for you," Cole said, his voice a raw whisper. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound gratitude. "You are not a Chishi anymore," she said. "You are a man of the earth." Cole looked at her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, but her eyes still holding that unyielding spark. He had expected to see only scars, a symbol of brokenness. Instead, he saw a woman whose spirit was as vast and beautiful as the Arizona sky. He saw a woman who had taught him how to live again. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief after the heat of the day. They sat in silence, their hands clasped, their bodies a single quiet presence in the vast, silent expanse of the desert. The next morning the army came. They were a small, disciplined force, a scouting party looking for a deserter. Cole's heart pounded in his chest. He was a man who had chosen a new path, but the ghosts of his past had finally caught up to him. He was ready to face them. He stood with the elders, his body straight, his face a calm mask. He was a man who had nothing to hide, a man who was ready to face the consequences of his actions. The army commander, a man with a stern face and a cold gaze, looked at Cole. "Ethan Colton," he said, his voice a low, hard command. "You are under arrest. You are a deserter. You will come with us." Cole looked at the commander, and then at the village. He looked at Nahili, at her face, filled with a quiet fear. He had a choice to make. He could go with them, and he would be punished. He would be sent to a prison or worse, or he could fight. But before he could say a word, an old man, a tribal elder, stepped forward. He spoke in a rush of words, his voice filled with a powerful, unyielding authority. The commander, a man of rules and regulations, was taken aback. He looked at the elder, then at Cole, then back at the elder, confusion on his face. The elder, a man with a face as old as the mountains, spoke again, his voice filled with a profound, undeniable conviction. He spoke of a man who had saved a life, a man who had fought for a people he had once been taught to hate. He spoke of a man who was no longer a soldier, but a son of the earth. The commander, a man who had seen so much violence, so much hate, looked at the old man, then at Cole, and a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He looked at the villagers, at their faces, filled with a quiet, unyielding support. He saw a community that was not afraid. He saw a people who had found a new kind of strength. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to his men. "We leave," he said. "He is not here." Cole watched them go, his heart filled with a profound sense of relief. He was free. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man with a new life, a new purpose. He had a home, a people, and a woman who had shown him the true meaning of beauty. He had come to the desert to die, but he had found a reason to live. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his journey had just begun. The army patrol's departure left a quiet void in the heart of the village. The relief was palpable, a gentle exhale after a long-held breath. Cole stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the faces of a people who had, moments ago, risked everything for him. The elders, the warriors, the women, and the children. Their eyes no longer held wariness, but a profound and grateful respect. He was no longer just a guest, he was one of them. Nahile's father, Haneye, approached him, his face a silent testament to a newfound trust. He didn't speak in English, but in Apache, a language Cole was slowly, painstakingly learning. Nahile stood beside them, her hand on Cole's arm, her presence a bridge between two worlds. She translated her father's words, her voice a soft murmur. "My father says you have earned your place among us. He says we have a gift for you." Haneye pointed to a small empty plot of land on the edge of the village, a spot with a clear view of the mountains. "A home," Nahile translated. "It is for you. We will help you build it." Cole felt a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to bring him to his knees. He had spent his life running from home, from a family he had lost, from a past he could not face. He had sought a place of isolation, a barren land where he could be a ghost. But now here, in a world so foreign and so beautiful, he was being offered a home. He looked at Nahile, his eyes filled with a raw, unvarnished gratitude. She simply smiled, her eyes as deep and dark as the night sky. She had brought him here, to a place he never knew he wanted, a place he now knew he could not live without. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Cole, a man who had built his own solitary cabin, now worked alongside the men of the village, his hands learning new skills, his mind unlearning old ones. He learned to cut and shape the wood with a stone tool, to weave the reeds for the walls, to mix the mud for the mortar. He was no longer just a soldier, he was a builder, he was a creator. He worked with Goyaweye, the young warrior who had once been so suspicious of him. Their relationship had changed from a grudging truce to a quiet, easy friendship. They spoke in a broken mix of English and Apache, a language of their own invention. Cole taught Goyaweye how to use a lever to lift a heavy log, how to set a roof beam. Goyaweye, in turn, taught him the names of the trees, the stories of the land, the songs of his people. Nahele was a constant presence. She brought him water, a cool drink on a hot day. She brought him food, a warm meal when he was exhausted. She spoke to him in her soft, melodic language, her words a soothing balm to his weary soul. She showed him how to weave the reeds so they would be strong, how to tie the knots so they would hold. She was his teacher, his guide, his partner. Their relationship was a quiet, unspoken thing. There were no grand declarations, no passionate embraces. It was a love built on respect, on understanding, on a shared history of pain and a common dream of peace. She was a woman who had taught him how to live again, and he was a man who had given her a reason to trust. The home was a simple structure, a round wickiup with a domed roof and a central fire pit. It was not as sturdy as his log cabin, but it was filled with something his old home had never known: life. It was a testament to the community, to the new family he had found. On the day the home was finished, the elders came and blessed it. Chiniwi, the wise old man who had spoken for him, placed his hand on Cole's shoulder, a silent gesture of acceptance. "It is a good home," he said in English, his voice a low rumble. "It is a place where you can find peace." Cole looked at the home, at the fire already burning in the center, its smoke a thin white line against the blue sky. He looked at Nahele, her face radiant in the soft light of the setting sun. He had come to the desert to be a ghost, but he had found a place where he could be a man. He had expected to see only scars, a symbol of brokenness. But she had shown him a different kind of beauty, a beauty that was not in her body, but in her soul. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was finally, truly home. The weeks that followed were a testament to the quiet, profound partnership that had blossomed between Cole and Nahele. Their relationship was not one of grand gestures, but of a deep, silent understanding. They moved through the world as a single unit, their thoughts and actions a seamless, unspoken language. One morning, the village was preparing for a hunting trip. A large deer was needed to feed the community for the coming winter. Cole, now a man of the village, was expected to join the hunt. He was a skilled marksman, a man with a gun, a tool that was both a blessing and a curse. Nahele, a woman of the earth, was a natural tracker, a woman who could read the land with a knowledge that was ancient and profound. The elders decided to send them together, a test of their new partnership. They set out at dawn, the air crisp and cool, the sun just beginning to paint the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. Cole carried his rifle, its weight a familiar comfort in his hands. Nahele carried a bow and a quiver of arrows, her movements as fluid and graceful as a shadow. They walked in silence for a long time, their footsteps a soft whisper on the packed earth. Nahele led the way, her eyes fixed on the ground, her gaze reading the story of the animals that had passed this way. She pointed to a broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss, a faint track in the dust. Cole, a man who had learned to read a map, was learning to read a book of a different kind. He saw the land through her eyes, a world filled with a secret language of life and death, of a delicate balance that was constantly in motion. He saw the saguaros not as silent sentinels, but as living beings with a soul. He saw the wind not as a harsh, unforgiving force, but as a messenger, a quiet whisperer of secrets. They came to a small stream, and Nahele knelt, her hand touching the cool, clear water. "The deer will come here," she said, her voice a low murmur. "They will drink at midday. We will wait." They found a hiding place, a small cluster of boulders with a clear view of the stream. They sat in silence, their bodies still, their senses on high alert. Cole, a man who had learned to hunt by instinct, was learning to hunt by patience. He was learning to be a part of the land, not a conqueror of it. As the sun reached its zenith, A deer emerged from the thicket. It was a magnificent creature, its antlers a crown of 1,000 points. It was a sign of a good hunt, a sign of a successful journey. Cole raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger. He had a clear shot. He could end this now. But he hesitated. He looked at Nahele. She was not a woman who wanted to kill. She was a woman who wanted to live. She had a deep, abiding respect for the life of all things. He had come here to kill, to provide, but he was learning a different way. Nahele, without a word, reached for her bow. She drew the string back, the movement a silent, graceful dance. She was not a woman of violence, but she was a woman who would provide for her people. Her arrow flew, a silent, deadly whisper in the air. The deer fell, its body a testament to the skill of a woman who was both a hunter and a healer. Cole was a man of the gun, but he had learned a different kind of lesson. He had learned that violence was not the only answer. He had learned that there was a power in patience, a strength in respect, a beauty in a life that was lived in harmony with the world. As they carried the deer back to the village, their bodies sore, their hands tired, they walked in a silent, unspoken understanding. He was a man who had been taught to fight. She was a woman who had been taught to live. They were a team, a partnership, a single unit. He had expected to see only scars, a symbol of brokenness. But she had shown him a different kind of beauty, a beauty that was not in her body but in her soul, a beauty that had healed him, a beauty that had given him a reason to live. Peace, in the heart of the desert, was a fragile thing. It was a delicate blossom that could be withered by the slightest breath of wind. For weeks the village had lived in a state of quiet contentment. The bounty hunters were gone, the army had left, and Cole, a man who had been a ghost, had found a home. But the ghosts of the past were not so easily exorcised. Cole was working with Hane, Nahele's father, mending a section of the village's outer fence. The work was simple, the rhythm of it a soothing balm to his mind. He was a man who had found his place, a man who was no longer haunted by the violence of his past. Suddenly, Hane stopped, his body tense. He held up a hand, a silent signal. Cole stopped as well, his senses on high alert. He heard nothing, he saw nothing. But Hane was looking at the ground, his gaze fixed on a single, almost imperceptible footprint. "What is it?" Cole whispered. Hane pointed to the footprint, a long, narrow mark with a distinctive heel. "A chishi," he said, his voice low and grim. "And not a soldier, a tracker. He has been here before. He is a hunter." Cole's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the footprint. He had seen it before, on the trail to his old cabin, in the battle with the bounty hunters. It was the footprint of the man with the scarred face, the leader of the bounty hunters, the man who had left Nahele for dead. But he had died. Cole had seen him fall. He had seen his body. "It cannot be," Cole said, his voice filled with disbelief. Hane shook his head. "It is him," he said, his eyes fixed on the footprint. "His soul has returned. He is a ghost." Cole felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had not killed the man. He had let him live. He had made a choice to be a man of peace, and that choice had come back to haunt him. The man had not died, he had simply been wounded, left for dead. And now, he had returned. He was no longer a man fighting for money. He was a man fighting for revenge. He was a man fighting for Cole. Cole's mind raced. He had to warn the village. He had to prepare them. He had to face his past, a past that had returned with a vengeance. He had to face the man he had chosen not to kill, the man who was now a ghost of his own making. They returned to the village, their faces grim. The news spread like a wildfire, a silent, terrifying whisper. The man with the scarred face, the chishi who had brought so much pain, had returned. The peace so hard won was shattered. The elders, their faces filled with a new kind of worry, gathered. Cole was a man of peace, a man who had chosen a new path. But the man who was coming for him was a man of violence, a man who would not rest until he had what he wanted. He wanted Cole. Nahele came to him, her face pale, her eyes filled with a quiet fear. "He is a ghost," she said, her voice a low murmur. "He will not stop. He will not rest. He will come for you." Cole took her hand, his body tense. "I will not let him hurt you," he said, his voice a fierce whisper. "I will not let him touch this village. I will fight him. I will end this." But he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was not a fight he could win with a gun. This was a fight he had to win with his soul. He had chosen a new path, a path of peace and forgiveness. But the ghosts of his past were not so easily put to rest. He had expected to see only scars, a symbol of brokenness. But she had shown him a different kind of beauty, a beauty that was born of a profound compassion, a wisdom that was as old as the mountains themselves. And he knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that he was ready for the final test. The bounty hunter, a man named Silas, was a ghost. He was not a man of flesh and blood, but a shadow, a phantom who moved through the desert with a silent, deadly purpose. He had been left for dead, his body a broken mess. He had crawled through the desert, his mind filled with a single burning desire: revenge. He wanted Cole. He wanted to make him pay for his choices. Cole, now a man of the village, was a different kind of ghost. He was a man who had chosen to disappear, a man who had chosen to be invisible, but he had been found, and now he had to face his past. The game began. Silas, a master of stealth, a man who knew how to hunt, began to play his game. He left signs for Cole to find, a trail of a taunting, cruel message, a dead rabbit, its body pinned to a tree with a single, brutal knife, a crude drawing on a rock, a picture of a man with a gun, a woman with a broken body. It was a message, a promise. He was coming. Cole, a man who had learned to be a tracker, a man who had learned to read the land, read the messages. He knew what they meant. Silas was not a man who wanted a quick fight. He wanted to make Cole suffer. He wanted to make him pay. The village was on edge. The fear was a palpable thing, a cold, silent presence. The elders who had trusted Cole were now filled with a new kind of doubt. He was a man of peace, but his past was a sickness that had returned to haunt them. Nahele was a constant source of strength. She was not a woman who would cower in the face of fear. She was a woman who would fight. She saw the signs, the subtle, cruel messages that Cole was seeing. She was his partner, his guide, his confidant. One afternoon, as they were gathering wild berries, Nahele stopped, her body tense. She pointed to a small, almost imperceptible disturbance in a patch of dirt. It was a single, solitary footprint. It was a footprint Cole had not seen. It was the footprint of Silas. "He is close," Nahele said, her voice a low whisper. "He is watching us." Cole's heart pounded in his chest. Silas was playing a different kind of game. He was not just hunting him. He was hunting her. He wanted to hurt her. He wanted to make Cole suffer. He looked at Nahele, at her face, filled with a quiet, unyielding courage. He had come here to protect her. He had come here to give her a life of peace. But now he had brought her into a war. He had a choice to make. He could fight. He could use his knowledge, his skills, his rifle to end this. He could kill Silas, a man who was a ghost of his own making, or he could find a different way. He looked at Nahele, and he knew the answer. He had chosen a new path. He had chosen to be a man of peace. He would not become a murderer. He would not become the man he had once been. They returned to the village, their faces grim. The elders were waiting. Cole explained the new threat. He explained that Silas was not a man who could be fought with a gun. He was a man who had to be outwitted. He had to be outsmarted. The elders listened, their faces filled with a profound sense of worry. They were a people of honor, a people of war. They did not understand a war that was fought with the mind. Cole knew this was his final test. He had to prove to them and to himself that his new path was a true one. He had to prove that he was not the man he had once been. He had to prove that he was worthy of the trust they had placed in him. The village was in a state of quiet, tense preparation. The women were packing supplies, the men were sharpening their weapons, and the children were being sent to the hidden cave in the mountains. The ghost of Silas was a palpable presence, a shadow that hung over their every move. Cole, a man who had found his place, now felt a deep, profound sense of unease. He had brought this sickness to their home. He was the reason they were in danger. He had left a man for dead, and that man had returned to haunt him. One evening, as the sun began to set, an old woman came to him. She was Nahele's grandmother, Azan, a woman of deep wisdom and quiet strength. She sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. She spoke in a low, melodic voice, her words a soothing balm to his weary soul. She told him a story, a tale of a warrior who had killed many men, a warrior who had been haunted by the ghosts of his past, a warrior who could not find peace. "My grandson," she said, her voice filled with a quiet compassion. "You have walked a long road, you have carried a heavy burden, but a man cannot walk forward while looking back. You must make peace with the ghosts of your past. You must forgive yourself." Cole looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sorrow. "I cannot," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper. "I have done things that cannot be forgiven." Astzan shook her head. "The earth forgives," she said. "The sky forgives. The water forgives. The heart of a man is like the desert. It is empty until it is filled with rain. You must fill your heart with forgiveness." She took his hand, her old wrinkled palm a warm comfort. "Come," she said. "We will make a fire of cleansing, a fire of forgiveness." She led him to a quiet place away from the village, a small clearing in the middle of a stand of juniper trees. She built a small fire, the flames a tiny beacon in the vast silent expanse of the night. She sat him down and handed him a small, smooth stone. "This stone," she said, her voice a low murmur, "is your past. It is the anger. It is the pain. It is the shame. You must speak your heart to it. You must tell it all the things you have carried, and then you must throw it into the fire. You must watch it burn. You must let it go." Cole looked at the stone. He held it in his hand, its weight a physical manifestation of his soul. He looked at the fire, its flames a beckoning light. He took a deep breath, and he began to speak. He spoke of the war, the violence, the countless men he had killed. He spoke of the guilt, the shame, the emptiness that had consumed his soul. He spoke of his fear, his isolation, his desperation to be a ghost. He spoke until his voice was raw, until his heart was empty. He then looked at the stone. He held it in his hand, and for the first time in his life he felt a profound, a spiritual sense of peace. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man who had faced it. He was a man who had chosen to forgive himself. He threw the stone into the fire. It landed with a soft, quiet thud, and the flames, a brilliant, radiant light, consumed it. He watched it burn, the heat a soothing balm on his face. He felt a profound sense of release, a weight lifted from his shoulders. He was free. He looked at Astzan, and he saw a quiet, understanding smile on her face. She was a woman who had seen so much, a woman who had known so much pain, but she had also known the power of forgiveness. He was a man who had come to the desert to die, but he had found a new life. He had found a new path. He was no longer a ghost in the desert. He was a man. He was a son of the earth. He had found a home, a people, and a woman who had shown him the true meaning of beauty. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was ready to face the final test. The village, now a fortress in a world of uncertainty, was a place of quiet, tense contemplation. The ghost of Silas was a silent, menacing presence, a shadow that hung over their every move. But in the midst of the fear, a new kind of life was beginning to blossom. Cole and Naheli, two people who had found each other in the heart of a storm, were building a life together. They were not just partners in war, but partners in peace. They were a single unit, their thoughts and actions a seamless, unspoken language. One evening, as they sat by the fire in their new home, the silence between them was not a void, but a quiet, comfortable presence. Naheli was weaving a basket, her hands moving with a practiced, graceful rhythm. Cole was mending his rifle, its weight a familiar comfort in his hands. Naheli finally spoke, her voice a low, melodic murmur. "My mother," she said, "she tells me stories of my people, the stories of our past. She wants me to teach them to my children." Cole looked at her, and his heart filled with a profound sense of hope. "Children," he said, his voice a quiet whisper. "Our children." Naheli looked at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the flickering firelight. "Yes," she said, "our children." They sat in a shared silence, a world of possibilities opening up before them. Cole had never thought of a future. His life had been a series of moments, a long, lonely journey from one isolated place to the next. He had been a man with no purpose, a man with no home, a man with no future. But now he had a dream. He had a dream of a family, a dream of a life, a dream of a future. He looked at Naheli, at her face, filled with a quiet hope. He had a dream of a son who would learn to hunt, a son who would learn the stories of his people. He had a dream of a daughter who would learn to weave, a daughter who would learn the songs of her mother. He had a dream of a life that was not filled with violence but with peace. "What will we teach them?" he asked, his voice a low, raw whisper. Naheli smiled. "We will teach them the stories of my people," she said. "The stories of the earth, the stories of the stars. We will teach them the language of the land. And you, my love, you will teach them the language of your people, the language of the books, the language of the world. They will be a bridge between two worlds, a new life, a new people." Cole felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took his breath away. He was a man who had been taught to fight, a man who had been taught to kill. But now he was a man who was learning to live. He was learning to be a father, a husband, a man who was worthy of a future. He reached out and took her hand. "I will teach them everything I know," he said, his voice a promise. "I will teach them how to live in peace, how to love, how to forgive." The fire crackled, its flames a quiet, comforting presence in the vast, silent expanse of the night. Cole looked at Nahele, and he saw a world of hope in her eyes. He had come to the desert to die, but he had found a new life. He had found a new path. He was no longer a ghost in the desert. He was a man. He was a son of the earth. He had found a home, a people, and a woman who had shown him the true meaning of beauty. The quiet calm of the village was shattered by a sudden, jarring betrayal. The ghost of Silas, a man who had been a shadow, had found a body. He had found a man who was willing to betray his own people for a handful of gold. The man was a young warrior named Apache, he who lies. A man who had always been a solitary figure, a man who had felt unseen by the elders and unappreciated by the other warriors. Silas had found him, had spoken to him in a language of greed and resentment, and had promised him a life of riches, a life of power. Silas's new plan was simple and cruel. He would not attack the village directly. He would not use brute force. He would use a more insidious weapon, betrayal. He had learned from the last battle. He had learned that the Apache were a people who fought with honor. He would use that honor against them. Apache was to be his spy, his inside man. He would lead Silas to the hidden cave where the women and children were being kept. He would open the gate. He would lead them to the heart of the village. He would betray his own people for a promise of gold. Cole felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The bounty hunter had not given up. He had simply changed his tactics. He was no longer a man who fought with a gun. He was a man who fought with his mind. He was a ghost, a phantom, who had returned to haunt them. The elders were on edge. The air was filled with a sense of foreboding. They did not know who they could trust. They did not know who the enemy was. They were a people of honor, and they did not understand betrayal. Nahele was a constant source of strength. She had an intuition, a quiet, almost spiritual sense of the world. She felt the unease, the subtle, silent presence of a new kind of evil. She watched Apache, his movements a subtle, silent lie. She saw the way his eyes lingered on Cole, a cold, resentful gaze. She saw the way he spoke to the elders, his words a smooth, polished lie. One evening, as Cole was working in his garden, she came to him, her face filled with a quiet, terrible certainty. "It is him," she said, her voice a low murmur. "He is working with the ghost." Cole looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "How do you know?" "I see it in his eyes," she said. "I feel it in the air. He is a man who is lost. He has forgotten who he is." Cole knew she was right. He had seen the same thing in the eyes of the men he had fought with. He had seen the way a man could lose his soul for a handful of gold. He had to act. He had to stop Apache before it was too late. He went to Hane, to the elders. He explained his theory. He explained that Silas was not a man who could be fought with a gun. He was a man who had to be outsmarted. He had to be outwitted. He had to be stopped. The elders listened, their faces filled with a profound sense of worry. They were a people who had faced so much, but they had never faced a threat that came from within. Cole knew this was his final test. He had to prove to them that he was not the man he had once been. He had to prove that he was worthy of their trust. He had to prove that he was a man who could fight for peace, not just for war. The final confrontation began with a whisper. Apache, the betrayer, had left the village under the cover of darkness. He was a man who had chosen a new path, a path of greed and resentment. He was a man who had chosen to betray his own people. Cole, his heart pounding in his chest, knew what he was doing. He was leading Silas to the hidden cave where the women and children were being kept. He was leading him to the heart of the village. He had to stop him. He and Goyawaye, the young warrior now a trusted friend, followed Apache's trail. They moved in silence, their bodies a blur of motion. Cole was no longer a man of the gun. He was a man of the earth. He was a man who was fighting for his home. They came to the cave, a small hidden entrance in the side of a mountain. Apache was there, a shadow in the moonlight, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the entrance. Silas was a short distance away, a phantom in the darkness, his rifle in his hands, a cruel smile on his face. Cole felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took his breath away. This was it, the final test, the ultimate confrontation. He had a choice to make. He could kill them. He could use his knowledge, his skills, his rifle to end this now, or he could find a different way. He looked at Nahele, at her face, filled with a quiet, unyielding courage. She was the reason he was here. She was the reason he had chosen a new path. She was the reason he had chosen to live. He whispered to Goyaway, his voice a low murmur, "We will not kill them. We will take them alive. We will show them that we are not a people of violence. We are a people of peace." Goyaway looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and a profound respect. He was a warrior, a man of honor, but he was also a man who had come to trust a Chishi who had chosen a new path. They moved with a silent, efficient grace. Cole, a man who had learned to fight with his mind, outsmarted Silas. He used the terrain, the shadows, the wind to his advantage. He was no longer a man who fought with brute force. He was a man who fought with his soul. The fight was a brutal, silent dance. Silas, a man who was a master of stealth, was no match for a man who had become a ghost. Cole disarmed him, his movements a blur of practiced efficiency. He held his rifle to Silas's head. He could end this now. He could avenge Nahele. He could end the threat. But he didn't. He looked at Silas, at his face, filled with a mixture of rage and a cold, terrible fear. He was a man who had lost everything, a man who had chosen a path of violence. And in that moment, Cole saw a reflection of his own past. He saw a man who had been lost, a man who had been broken. He lowered his rifle. "I will not kill you," he said, his voice a low, hard whisper. "You are not a ghost anymore. You are a man, and you will face the consequences of your actions." He looked at Apache, the betrayer. He was a man who had chosen greed over honor. He was a man who had betrayed his own people. Cole looked at him, and he saw a man who was a ghost of his own making. Goyaway, a man who had seen the whole thing, a man who had witnessed the power of a different kind of war, came to Cole. He put his hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of respect. He had seen a warrior who was a man of peace. He had seen a man who had chosen a new path. The village, now a fortress in a world of uncertainty, was a place of quiet, victorious peace. Silas, the ghost of Cole's past, and Apache, the betrayer, were bound and brought before the council. The elders, their faces filled with a quiet, unyielding authority, judged them. They were not a people who believed in a quick and easy punishment. They were a people who believed in justice. Cole stood with them, a silent witness. He was no longer a man who was running from his past. He was a man who had faced it. He had a choice, and he had chosen to be a man of peace. The elders did not sentence them to death. They sentenced them to exile. They were to be cast out into the desert, a world without water, a world without food, a world without a home. They were to be a ghost, a shadow, a phantom in the vast, silent expanse of the desert. Silas, a man who had chosen violence, was now a man who was facing the consequences of his actions. He was a man who was a ghost of his own making. Apache, a man who had chosen greed over honor, was now a man who was a ghost of his own making. The village, a community that had been on the edge of a storm, was now in a state of quiet, victorious peace. The children were returned from the hidden cave, their laughter a beautiful, joyful sound. The women and men returned to their daily tasks, their hands now holding the tools of a new life. Cole sat with Nahele by the fire in their new home. He was a man who had found his place, a man who was no longer haunted by the violence of his past. He had a home, a people, and a woman who had shown him the true meaning of beauty. Nahele looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet, profound love. "You did not kill them," she said, her voice a low murmur. "You chose a different path. You chose peace." Cole took her hand, his rough, calloused palm a stark contrast to her soft, delicate one. "I chose you," he said, his voice a promise. "I chose a new life. I chose peace." He was a man who had come to the desert to die, but he had found a reason to live. He had found a reason to fight. He was no longer a ghost in the desert. He was a man. He was a son of the earth. He was a husband. He was a father. His journey had not ended. It had just begun. The dust settled over the village, not with the abruptness of battle, but with the slow, gentle grace of a world finding its equilibrium. The air, once thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of fear, now carried the sweet perfume of juniper smoke and the rich, earthy smell of rain on dry ground. The war, both the physical and the spiritual one, was over. The village, bruised but not broken, entered a period of quiet, profound healing. For Cole, the change was more than a mere end to conflict. It was the beginning of a new existence. His days, once spent in a solitary vigil, were now filled with a purpose that resonated deep in his soul. He was a man with a new home, a new people, and a new life. He no longer felt the cold dread of a deserter, the gnawing emptiness of a man with no future. He was a man who had earned his place, a man who had fought for a life he never knew he wanted. The rebuilding of the village was a communal act of faith. Every person, young and old, had a role. Cole, his hands calloused from years of handling a rifle, now found a new kind of strength in shaping wood, in laying stone, in weaving the intricate patterns of reeds for the walls of the homes. He worked alongside the men, sharing their laughter, their quiet conversations, their unspoken sorrows. He was learning their language, not just the words, but the cadence, the rhythm, the stories that were woven into every syllable. He found himself speaking less, listening more. The world, once a place of harsh, brutal realities, was now a place of subtle, beautiful truths. His relationship with Nahele was the quiet center of this new world. They were not just two people who had survived a storm, they were two souls who had found each other on the other side of it. Their love was not a tempest, but a river, a slow, steady current that flowed with an unyielding grace. They spent their evenings in their new home, a small circular wickiup that was filled with the warmth of a fire and the soft light of a tallow candle. They spoke of their day, of the small victories and the quiet defeats. He would tell her of his time with the men, of the lessons he was learning. She would tell him of her time with the women, of the songs they sang, the stories they shared. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Nahele began to sing. It was a low melodic sound, a song that spoke of the moon and the stars, of the earth and the sky. It was a song of her people, a song of a life that was lived in harmony with the world. Cole listened, his heart filled with a profound sense of peace. He had spent his life in a world of loud, violent noises, but now in the quiet of a desert night, he had found the true music of the soul. He began to share his own stories, the stories of his past, not as a soldier, but as a boy. He told her of his home in Illinois, of the vast green fields, of the snow that fell in the winter, of the smell of rain on a humid summer day. He spoke of his family, of a life that was so far removed from this world, it felt like a dream. Nahele listened with an unwavering stillness, her dark eyes filled with a quiet compassion. She was not just a listener, she was a keeper of stories. She was a keeper of his soul. The village, in its healing, entered a sacred time of remembrance. A small ceremony was held for those who had fallen in the battle. Cole stood with the warriors, his head bowed, his heart filled with a profound sorrow for the lives that had been lost. He was not a warrior of their tribe, but he was a man who had fought beside them, a man who had seen their courage. He was a man who had a new kind of family, a new kind of home. As the ceremony ended, an old man, a shaman, with a face as old as the mountains, came to Cole. He took Cole's hand and held it. "The earth remembers," he said, his voice a low melodic sound. "The wind remembers. But a new life begins with a new dawn." Cole looked at the old man, and he knew that the war was not just over on the outside, it was over on the inside as well. He had faced his past, he had fought his demons, he had found his peace. He was a man who had been a ghost in the desert, a man who had expected to see only scars, but she had shown him a world of true beauty. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was ready for a new dawn. He was ready for a new life. He was ready to live. The village, now fully healed and restored, began to look to the future. The memory of the conflict was not forgotten, but it was no longer the defining force of their lives. In the newfound peace, a beautiful blending of two worlds began to take shape, a testament to the power of trust and the resilience of the human spirit. Cole, his role in the village firmly established, began to share his knowledge in ways that went beyond mere defense. He was a man of the gun, but he was also a man of tools, of building, of a different kind of ingenuity. He worked with the men to design and build a new kind of irrigation system, one that used the natural flow of the river to bring water to their crops with greater efficiency. It was a skill he had learned on his family's farm, a practical knowledge that was now a gift to a people who had welcomed him as their own. Nahele was his partner in this endeavor, her ancient wisdom and his modern skills a perfect, harmonious blend. She knew the language of the river, the places where the water ran deepest, the times when the flow was at its strongest. She knew the language of the plants, the crops that would thrive in the new soil, the herbs that would bring strength to the community. They were not just building a system, they were weaving a new kind of life, a life that was born of two worlds. Their relationship deepened in this shared work. They spoke of the future, of the children they would have, the stories they would tell them, the lessons they would teach them. Cole would tell her of the wonders of his world, of the great cities, the vast oceans, the 1,000 different cultures. Nahele would tell him of the wonders of her world, of the sacred mountains, the whispering deserts, the spirits that watched over the land. They were building a bridge, a quiet, spiritual bridge between two worlds that had once been enemies. A powerful, symbolic event cemented Cole's place in the community. Chiniwi, the wise old elder, came to him one day. "My grandson," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the time has come. You must be given a name that is not of the Chishi world, but of our world, a name that is earned, not given." Cole felt a surge of emotion, a name, a new identity. He had been so many things in his life, a son, a soldier, a deserter, a ghost, but now he was to be a man of a new people. He was to be a man of the earth. The naming ceremony was a simple but profound affair. The entire village gathered around a fire, their faces a tapestry of light and shadow. The elders, their voices a soft, melodic chant, spoke of Cole's journey. They spoke of his courage, his compassion, his willingness to fight for a people he had once been taught to hate. They spoke of the trust he had earned, the life he had saved, the path he had chosen. Nahele stood by his side, her hand in his. Her presence was a silent testament to the man he had become. She was the one who had seen his heart, the one who had believed in him when he did not believe in himself. She was the one who had brought him home. Chiniwi came to Cole, his gaze filled with a profound, unspoken pride. He placed his hand on Cole's shoulder, a gesture of deep, abiding acceptance. "Your name is Yainde," he said, his voice a low, powerful sound. "It means Sunman. You have brought the sun to a people who have lived in darkness. You have brought a new light to a world that was filled with shadows." Cole felt the words resonate deep in his soul. He was a Sunman. He was a man who had brought light. He was no longer a ghost in the desert. He was a man with a name, a man with a purpose, a man who belonged. He had expected to see only scars, a symbol of brokenness, but she had shown him a different kind of beauty, a beauty that was not in her body, but in her soul, a beauty that had healed him, a beauty that had given him a reason to live, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that his journey had not ended, it had just begun. Years passed. The scars on the land had faded, replaced by the vibrant life of a thriving village. The river, once a mere trickle, now flowed with a strong, unyielding current, a testament to the new irrigation system that had brought life back to the earth. The corn and squash grew in abundance, their green stalks a beautiful contrast to the muted tones of the desert. The village was a place of peace, a place of life, a place of hope. Cole, or Yainde as he was now known, was no longer a stranger in a strange land. He was a man of the village, a father, a husband, an elder. His hair was streaked with grey, his face a tapestry of lines that were a testament to a life well lived. He was a man who had found his purpose, a man who had found his home. His children were a beautiful blend of two worlds. His son, a boy with his mother's eyes and his father's quiet strength, knew the stories of his people, the language of the land. He knew how to track a deer, how to read the stars. He also knew the stories of his father's world, the stories of the great cities, the vast oceans, the 1,000 different cultures. He was a bridge between two worlds, a testament to a love that had defied all odds. Nahele, her face as beautiful as the day he had found her, was a woman of immense wisdom and quiet strength. She was the heart of the village, the keeper of stories, the keeper of their souls. She was the one who had seen his heart, the one who had believed in him when he did not believe in himself. She was the one who had brought him home. The bounty hunters, their greed and violence a distant memory, were now a ghost of a past that no longer haunted them. The army, a force of nature that had once been a threat, now lived in a peaceful, if distant, coexistence with the village. The war was over, both the physical one and the internal one. One evening, as the sun began to set, Cole and Naheli stood together on a high ridge overlooking the village. The air was cool and crisp, the sky a vast canvas of fiery hues of orange and purple. The village, a tiny beacon of life in the vast, silent expanse of the desert, was a testament to the power of a single, beautiful choice. Cole looked at the land, at the mountains that stood like silent sentinels, at the river that flowed with a song of peace. He had come to the desert to be a ghost, but he had found a new life, he had found a new path. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man who had faced it. He was a man who had found his purpose. Nahel took his hand, her palm a warm, comforting presence. "Look," she said, her voice a low, melodic murmur. "The stars are coming." Cole looked up at the sky, a vast, velvety blackness that was filled with 1,000,000 points of light. He had seen the stars before, a silent, lonely spectacle in the night sky, but now he was not alone. He was with her. He was with a woman who had taught him how to see the world in a different way. He was with a woman who had shown him that a scar was not a sign of brokenness, but a testament to a story of resilience, a story of hope, a story of love. He looked at her face, filled with a quiet, profound love. He had expected to see only scars, a symbol of brokenness, but the beaten Apache woman he had rescued had showed him true beauty. She had showed him that a man could be healed, a man could be a son of the earth, a man could be a man. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was finally, truly and completely home. Their lives were a river, and their love was a star, a beacon of light in the vast, beautiful, silent expanse of the desert.